Now, we've heard from the Secretary of State. Let me take a moment to set the scene for the AI Fringe that kicked off this morning. I want to start by talking a bit about people, because the AI Fringe was created in response to an outpouring of interest from people in civil society, in industry, and in academia. The AI Fringe partner organisations wanted to create a forum for everyone to participate in conversations about AI. And we wanted to bring in experts to help answer some of the biggest questions about how AI will affect people in global society. We decided to create a week of programming here in the hub at the British Library, but we also invited anyone with an interest to host their own event and advertise it as part of the AI Fringe. And we have been absolutely blown away by the response. We have events happening in Manchester, Birmingham and Bristol, in Newcastle, in Edinburgh and Oxford, in Cambridge, Milton Keynes and Lincoln, as well as right across London. Our speakers include researchers and advocates, entrepreneurs and engineers, policymakers and regulators. Our hope is that we can capture this energy to help chart a path towards a more collaborative, safe and inclusive AI ecosystem. We want to add to the important discussions that are already taking place around the world, including this Wednesday and Thursday at Bletchley Park. The AI Fringe conversations happening this week are also intended as a jumping off point for further collaboration and debate. So thank you all for participating. And thank you to my brilliant colleagues at Milltown Partners and our events team, as well as our partners who made all of this possible. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. Number one, fire exits, they're at the front and the back of the theatre. Please make sure your phones are on silent if they aren't already. All sessions will be live streamed and available for delayed playback on the AI Fringe YouTube channel. Our X or Twitter handle is AI Summit Fringe and the hashtag is AI Fringe. We're also on LinkedIn if you search for AI Fringe. And also thank you in advance to all of you here and throughout the week for supporting our code of conduct, which is important to us and which you can find on the AI Fringe website. And now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker and moderator, a breakthrough thinker on the impact of technologies on society, as well as author and creator of the highly renowned newsletter and podcast Exponential View. He's a visiting fellow at Oxford University and Harvard Business School, and he advises senior executives across a number of global firms. Please join me in welcoming Azeem Azhar.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And good morning to all of you, both here and on the live stream. 11 months. It's been 11 months since ChatGPT was launched. That's less than a year, as we all know. And there's one word for it, which is wow. Sam Altman announced this launch with a very innocuous tweet, and I'll quote from it. He said, "Today we launched ChatGPT. Try talking with it here. Language interfaces are going to be a big deal, I think." This is very much a research release. And the day after the launch, Ars Technica, which is one of my favorite technical news sites, had something to say. They were, I suspect, a little sarcastic. Lo, another chatbot. OpenAI invites everyone to test ChatGPT, a new AI-powered chatbot with amusing results. ChatGPT aims to produce accurate and harmless talk, but it's a work in progress. We didn't really understand what was coming. Just on ChatGPT, it became one of the fastest growing products in history, quickest to 100 million users. There have been 1,400 academic papers submitted to arXiv about ChatGPT in the past 11 months, and billions of dollars of investments have been announced in companies that are building large language models, or LLMs, which is one of the technologies that underpins ChatGPT. Some of that frenzy is understandable. The business model of Silicon Valley and its copycats around the world, and the venture capital that funds them, is to drive momentum. That's what you and I might call hype, to create belief in a future market. Profit sometimes follows. But below that hype, there can also be something real, and LLMs and their successors seem to be real. But perhaps more significant than the frenzy of investors, their job, after all, is to be wrong marginally less often than they are right, is what we are all doing with the technology. Universities are contending with how to update their pedagogy. Age-old methods seem redundant and less effective at nurturing minds who have access to LLMs. Doctors are asking how the tools can improve diagnostic outcomes. And scientists are finding that these wonky, temperamental language models have been able to discover new relationships in biology, biochemistry, material science, and more. I've spoken to dozens, perhaps more than that, of CEOs and CFOs around the world, and companies are trying to figure out whether the technologies are going to help them grow their business, whether they're simply a tool for cost cutting, or perhaps these technologies will fundamentally unwind their business models. And I think for many of us here, we've probably found our personal productivity rise, and we've already brought LLMs or chatbots into our daily workflows. I mean, after all, trillions of words of knowledge compounded through these concepts, all in the palm of our hand. It's quite understandable. And of course, ChatGPT has electrified the policy space. There is surely a direct line from Altman's tweet to this week's Global AI Safety Summit in Bletchley Park, and all of those experts who are gathering there. That event has been pulled together at exponential speed. So it really is the case of the little chatbot that could. The funny thing is, though, that we don't really know what we have, what the core of this technology is. It's been gifted to us by scientists who themselves don't understand what these technologies do and how they work. They're prodding and poking to make sense of them, and new capabilities and vulnerabilities appear seemingly every day. Think of jailbreaks, prompt injections, and now visual prompt injections. One could say that we put the cart before the horse. One question is whether this really is artificial general intelligence. Unlikely, perhaps, but Peter Norvig, who is the co-author of the most popular academic textbook on artificial intelligence, it's called Artificial Intelligence, and Blaise Aguirre y Arcas from Google's AI team, argued recently that we'll look back at these tools as early signs of artificial general intelligence. They argue that these models perform competently at pretty much any information task that can be done by humans. I mean, they're saying this about systems that have known limitations. I mean, we know that LLMs have no understanding of anything, let alone the world. They don't plan ahead particularly well. They've got no memory of the type that enables rapid learning. They make stuff up, and you can fool them easily. And yet, Norvig and Aguirre y Arcas have made quite a strong argument. Shane Legg, who's a co-founder of DeepMind, has recently suggested that nevertheless we're quite close to artificial general intelligence. Large language models won't do the trick alone, he says, because they lack episodic memory and they lack the type 2 thinking, Kahneman's more reflective, deliberative system of cognition. But Legg reckons that what this does is it creates known research paths for scientists and a 50% chance that we'll build AGI by 2028. So whether or not today's technology represents a final word of AGI, and I don't think they do, whether they are theoretically robust, they probably aren't, LLMs are finding very, very widespread use. So to quote the 19th century French diplomat, I've forgotten his name and ChatGPT doesn't know, I can just give you the quote, artificial intelligence works in practice but not in theory. So let's take a step back and let's look at the much bigger picture. What has made us the dominant species in the planet? And it's really been our cognitive capacities, our ability to create new knowledge and compound that knowledge generation after generation. When we compound practical knowledge, we call it technology, and the rate with which we can compound that knowledge has increased significantly. Generations became decades, decades became years, years became months, and it could go much quicker with even today's AI systems as they interact across our economies in a faster flywheel of compounding, discovery, and action. And the remarkable thing is that between Claude and Bard and Bing and ChatGPT and U.com and the plethora of open source LLMs, today anyone with internet access can make use of this magic. In fact, more people have access to this proto-AI in your pocket than have access to adequate sanitation like clean water and flushing toilets. So perhaps this coming cognitive expansion, used wisely, will help us tackle these most important problems of humanity. Not just the big global ones like climate change, but the local issues of poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, and the absence of basic sanitation, those flushing toilets again. Now, some 50 years ago, Alvin Toffler introduced the idea of future shock, which described the social and psychological impact of rapid change, the kind of change that we've witnessed in the past 11 months. It is a future shock, a real disorientation. And in the late 1980s, British geographer David Harvey examined the intersection of technology and globalization, and he saw an ineluctable accelerating logic, which we are living through now, and he called it time-space compression, and it would result in economic and cultural dislocation, and anyone who's lived in Britain over the last 7 years will see some of those, that reflected. In my work, I've highlighted the challenge to our norms and institutions under the pressure of exponential technologies. So the future shock, the time-space compression, the exponential gap is real, and we're living through it. So how do we deal with it? What AI offers, what it inverts, creates, subverts, is far too broad and too deep. It's too uncertain. It's too unknowable to be solved by even the brightest minds in Bletchley Park. And in the coming years, artificial intelligence will have the characteristics of infrastructure. That is, the underlying systems upon which services are built. And as good sociologists know, the nature and design of infrastructure is a reflection of societal priorities and values. It becomes a tool to shape those relationships and power dynamics. Now, a perfect example of infrastructure as power is the case of the bridges on the Southern State Parkway in New Jersey. These were built in the 1930s as America expanded its road network. The engineers constructing these bridges over the parkway, which led to a beach, this infrastructure, were ordered to build them with a very low clearance, high enough for private cars, but far too low for public buses. Why? Well, those buses were filled with poorer blacks and Puerto Ricans. Infrastructure let the well-heeled past and kept the undesirables out. So infrastructure embeds values and politics, prejudices and power. It's not something to be left to the market and the logic of accumulation. Competitive markets are efficient allocators and terrible distributors, and uncompetitive markets are worse. This isn't a technical challenge that is solved by bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are great implementers, especially of complex minutiae, but they cannot speak of the conflicts within each of our politics. And AI is not merely infrastructure. It's also going to be the interface to all the resources that we need. It'll replace the search bar and the app icon. It'll start by mediating access to resources and eventually proactively organizing them for us. So how will we trust such systems? Will we allow the market to decide what's best for us, regardless of which of our many hats, citizen, consumer, carer, or companion we're wearing? After all, letting the market decide was the theory of the internet. We were told that Google's competitor was only one click away. And of course, the reason we all use Google on our phones and web browsers has everything to do with the quality of their search and absolutely nothing to do with the $26 billion a year the firm pays to be the default search engine on the aforementioned phones and web browsers. You see, unlike AI, which is working in practice but not in theory, the doctrines we've used to govern technology work in theory but not in practice. Market concentration and the political and economic distortions it creates is a real risk. Open source, public goods thinking, and utility-style regulation might offer alternatives. Now, through the work of scientists and researchers, I'm confident we'll find techniques to build provably safe, steerable, and aligned AI. But this doesn't mean we won't build low bridges, those barriers and toll gates, on our or someone else's every day. And that's why we're all here in this room and online, why the fringe events that have sprung around the summit matter, to work out how to fashion the practice, the habit, and the interventions that can shape the technology to serve us. That process cannot be a task solely for the top, issued by the diktats of the powerful and well-connected. It should also emerge from the grassroots, from the edges, from the many centers of our societies, however they define themselves, with their own traditions and local knowledge and histories. And those in power need to ensure that that process is nurtured so a deeper foundational trust can evolve. Because if the last 11 months have been unsettling, the next 11 are likely to prove more so. And I'm confident that if we invest not just in the science and the technology, but in genuine public engagement and deliberation, we'll be able to ride the turbulence through a deeper social resilience, a deeper trust, and set the foundations for delivering beneficial AI for everyone in every corner of the globe. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Azim. I know you're now going to introduce a panel for the next session. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Well, I hope they'll come on in. Hi, Mike. Why don't you all get your seats and then I'll do the intros. We'll do a little handshake. Nice to see you. Hi, Sarah. Great. Should we just take a quick second to get some water going? Would that make sense? For it. Yeah. I certainly need it after that. Let me, while I pour my water, introduce the panel from the far end. We've got Mike Wooldridge, who is the Professor of AI at Oxford University and Head of Foundational Models at the Turing. Rumaan Chowdhury, who is the co-founder and CEO of Humane Intelligence. And Sarah, and I've suddenly forgotten your surname.
Hooker, yeah.
Hooker, that's it. We met just last week as well.
Yeah.
Sarah Hooker, who runs Cohere for AI, which is Cohere's independent deep research lab. So we thank you, each of you, for being here. And I know you've all travelled quite a great distance, in some cases as far as Oxford, but I know Rumaan and Sarah have had longer trips. You know, we are the first panel of a week of Fringe events, and so I think it's important that we set the scene in some way. And what I'd like to do maybe is start with how each of you is using some aspect of AI in your professional, personal life, and a particular application that you find quite interesting despite your professional expertise. And maybe, Sarah, if we start with you, is there one that stands out for you?
Well, I think what's interesting about these models, in some ways, it allows for quick iteration of creativity. So a lot of the use cases that I personally use are related to that. I mean, I'm a researcher, so to be honest, I wouldn't say that I'm particularly gifted at painting or things like that, but often I use these tools as an iterative way to create and to think about, for example, what I want to paint or short stories that I want to generate. But in general, there's also these very compelling use cases for society as a whole. I think we've heard some of these mentioned today, but from a research perspective, I'm really fascinated about this, how this helps us kind of narrow down these large search spaces in areas like medicine or climate change and explore more of the possible combinations.
Wonderful, thank you. How about you, Rumaan?
Well, I'm going to be honest. After I shut my laptop for the day, I never want to think about technology again. It's actually very nice to have that mental break. I've moved from San Francisco, and since leaving San Francisco, that has actually been a treat for me. But in seriousness, you know, I think there are a lot of really interesting ways that AI is being used every day. And I think the one that strikes me the most, two things. One is medicine, which I think a lot of people refer to. Another one that I think goes under-discussed is weather. So models that have been built to better predict extreme weather. I actually live in Houston, Texas. My parents live there as well. They actually lost their first home in Hurricane Harvey. Since then, there have been models that have been created to better predict the path of hurricanes, which actually improves millions of people's lives. They can evacuate on time, et cetera. So that's actually one that I think has been quite beneficial and interesting. Also, to Sarah's point about creating stories, we actually have a demo set up in the lobby for people to play with, and one of it actually generates children's stories based on a profession, and you know, it sort of creates a story for you, and you can actually explore and see if there are gender biases or any sort of biases you may spot in the stories.
Thank you. How about you, Mike?
So I'm going to give two examples. I think the first I'm going to give, because so many people don't actually realize it's AI, and as an AI professional, I find it incredibly frustrating, and that's automated translation tools. I mean, Google Translate being the best known. And this is absolutely core AI. Unimaginable amounts of money have been spent on automated translation, and AI people deliver this, and it's successfully used by hundreds of millions of people every day. And now everybody takes it for granted. And it's astonishing how many people I talk to who don't even realize that this is AI. And it absolutely is core AI. And this is one of the ancient dreams of humanity, you know, being able to translate from one language to another. And we deliver it, and people don't even realize it's AI. So I think it's important to, and there are lots of other examples like that. Where AI, we just use it and we don't realize it's AI. And I think in the future, that's how a lot of people are going to encounter AI. Yeah. It's not going to be some kind of, you know, robot mind that they're going to be talking to. It's just going to be embedded in their working environment and they won't realize. But the other example that I'm going to pick on, because it was just entirely unexpected, which came out of large language models, is brainstorming. And, you know, traditionally, you know, if you're an advertising executive or whatever, you know, you need to brainstorm a new slogan for your product. What happens is a bunch of these execs, as I understand, they get locked in a room with a bottle of tequila and a packet of cigarettes, and nobody's allowed out until they've got at least five lines for the product. And what's amazing about large language models is you can just say, give me another line for this, give me another angle, and you can just keep pressing the button, and it will keep producing those. And entirely unexpected, the idea that brainstorming would be something that would fall out of that technology.
It's bad news for tequila vendors, by the sounds of things. You know, to your point about people not realizing that machine translation is AI, there is that old adage, which is that, you know, if it's not working in computer science, it's probably AI, and once it is working, it's just programming. I mean, how true is that? Ramon, you were nodding.
Entirely true. I think we do not. It's happened so rapidly yet so seamlessly. We don't realize that we have magical devices we hold and basically are glued to our hands all day, every day. You know, I don't know how I would function without my smartphone, but it was not that long ago that we navigated the world and interacted with people without the medium of the internet, a lot of which is driven by AI and machine learning.
Yeah. I want to share my favorite example. So I just bought some new bookshelves, and I had to move my books from the old bookshelves to the new ones, and I had, you know, a couple of hundred to move. And I stacked them, you know, randomly by color of spine, which is how else would you organize your books? And then I thought I'll take a photo of the books and send them to ChatGPT and tell me what my books are, which it did a pretty good job of. And then I said, how should I organize them in several categories? And it came up with some categories. And then I said, okay, now put the books in the categories, which it also did. And it was quite remarkable. Although of the books, it forgot half of them by the time it had to categorize them, and sort of done pretty well. And then as I started to prompt it after that to remember the other half of the books, it did the thing that these large language models can do, and it went off to La La Land. But just getting half of my books in 6 categories was about 80% of the problem, because you've got a backbone against which you can throw these the remainder of the books, and I think that speaks a little bit to each of to those examples. This idea that once we remember we have this ability, once you remember that you can use Waze or Google Maps to time manage your route, which we do now but didn't perhaps by default 10 years ago, you do have this magic in the palm of your hands. So I'm curious about one thing, Mike, and I want to come to you, which is about, as we have a technology like this, and we are introducing it and talking about it in a way that's really different to the way that we talked about Waze or machine translation or, you know, recommendation systems, which are the AI technologies of the last 15 years. Why are we talking about it so differently?
So we discussed this a lot with my colleagues over the last 11 months. I mean, why has it gone so viral? And I think there's two reasons for this. Firstly, large language model technology, you know, of which ChatGPT is obviously the best known, but it's incredibly accessible. You just point your web browser at it. You can be anywhere in the world. Anybody with access to the World Wide Web, anywhere in the world, can just point their web browser at ChatGPT, and they've got access to this incredibly powerful AI models, amongst the most sophisticated AI models in the world. So that's one reason. I think it's just very accessible. But secondly, for the first time, these are general purpose, and I'm using that phrase very carefully. I didn't say AGI, I said general purpose AI tools. You just have a conversation with it. You can ask it questions. You can ask it about the historical performance of Liverpool Football Club. You can ask it about quantum mechanics and so on, and it will be very fluently, albeit, as I dare say we will discuss very often erroneously, come back with answers for you. And it seems very impressive. It's eloquent, it seems very knowledgeable, and it feels like the kind of AI that we all expected. And it's the first time that we've all been exposed to that. As I say, AI's been embedded in our world, in our working world now for quite some time. And actually, historically, AI goes back obviously an awful long way before that. But this is the first time where people are really consciously aware that they're dealing with something which is AI. But I mean, again, and I think we'll probably come back and talk about this, my big worry about that is that we start to attribute things to it that absolutely aren't there. And I'm often asked, what is the most important message around this technology? And the most important message is, you are not dealing with a mind. That absolutely is not what you're dealing with.
No, I think that what you described as well also reminds me of the Oxford PPEist, who can talk about anything and is probably erroneous. And I guess the question is, are you talking
Couldn't possibly
to
comment.
a mind? But Sarah, you were nodding along there, and one thing I'm curious about is just that moment. Mike said, sort of 11 months ago, things spun around, and Cohere, of course, is really, really closely associated with the transformer technology that underpins the LLM. What was the sort of sense amongst you and your fellow practitioners when the dialogue seemed to change in November, December 2022?
Yeah, I think it's surreal. So I don't think anyone could have predicted the last year. The elements that Mike is talking about are very important. So this ability to probe, and because of that, the sense that with users that they're actually talking to an algorithm. I think a lot of, my role as a researcher in our lab, we build models, but the interface is just as important. And I think one of the reasons it's connected so deeply with millions of people across the world is this ability to change the inputs and see a dramatically different output. People really connected with the idea that, unlike the translation example before, which is really a model that is being built for this extremely specific use case, now we're building these models that combine any set of tasks and reveal different outputs. And so it has been, I would say, in some ways really exciting, because it means that people have connected so deeply with this work. I mean, I had a nurse asking me about chat models, which is kind of absurd if you think about it. We rarely, as researchers, have work that's released that connects so deeply with so many. But I kind of share where Mike is going at the same time. This is brittle. So these are research ideas that are deployed in millions of places overnight. So I think this is partly why we're all here this week, why this AI fringe exists, is to discuss how these models are shaped and who they impact.
So I want to pick up on one sentence there, which was research ideas that we're putting in front of millions of people. Of course, we see in other industries, in pharmaceuticals, for example, before you put a research idea in front of millions or billions of people, you have to go through a series of processes. Rumaan, you have spent a lot, you've been really busy this year in doing structured probing and pushing of these models through these exercises that we call red teaming. But that's coming off the back of a many year career thinking about the sort of beneficial deployment of AI in a broader sense. What's different this year and given your experiences in what you've done with some of these international red teaming exercises, to the response and the priorities of the previous years?
Oh, that's a really great question. Well, I'll start by actually pulling on the thread that you started. So structured public feedback, things like expert red teaming, bias bounty programs, public red teaming, are actually something that I've been toying with or playing with for some years. When I was at Twitter leading the machine learning ethics team, we actually did the first algorithmic bias bounty. So this was when we opened up a Twitter algorithm to the public and actually had them sort of compete. to identify harms that we wouldn't have identified as a team. And it gets at a very specific issue that actually, to Mike's point, that general purpose AI makes even bigger. Even in the world of narrow AI and machine learning, it was very, very hard / impossible to think of every single way that a model could possibly fall apart and test for it, right? So enter general purpose AI, these broad use cases. All of these large language model companies have red teams. So expert red teaming is when people who have expertise in a particular field, it could be InfoSec, ethics, biosecurity, et cetera, are brought in by the company to stress test their models. What we wanted to do with DEF CON is bring that to the
And DEF CON is this big sort of cybersecurity hacker convention that gets
every year
a bit like
Vegas.
Comic-Con, but about
Bigger.
cybersecurity.
Maybe, I don't know if it's bigger than Comic-Con. Comic-Con might actually be bigger. 30,000 people descending, 30,000 hackers descending upon Vegas, which, is the definition of pure chaos. I mean, but that's why we wanted it at DEF CON. Like this is the mindset we need. So bringing it to the public was, first of all, enabled by the fact that these models can be interacted with no code. So when we did our first nonprofit bias bounty pre-ChatGPT, we actually did in October, it was more of a programming exercise for ML experts. And the number one question we got was, can you do a no-code version? And as we were thinking about how to do a no-code bounty program, ChatGPT launched. And it basically enabled us to design these challenges that anybody can interact with. So as I mentioned earlier, if you go in the lobby, you can kind of see an example of how people might interact with them. But the way we did at DEF CON was designed around two types of challenges. One is your traditional prompt injection. This is like the hack that you use to get models to violate their terms of service. So just to define a prompt injection, basically the company has said you are not allowed to do thing X. They've created safeguards so you can't do it, but a prompt injection bypasses those. The thing that I'm interested in, I think, which is capturing the imagination of the public, but also, frankly, is the thing that stops a lot of these models from being commercially deployed, is embedded harm. So this, when you are in a natural interaction with the model, is it sharing misinformation? Is the output in some way discriminatory? And that's something that's incredibly difficult for a single team at a company to solve. So, our hypothesis is that, members of the public are actually better served to give us this information.
I think this also pushes a really important discussion around what red teaming is, because right now it's kind of the wild, wild west. Everyone does it differently. Some people just invite their friends over. Other people have dedicated teams that go for an entire year and ongoing. So there's a lack of precision. We often talk about red team as if it's this official scientific term, but it's so far from that.
It's very much
so putting in the public forum, I think, really brings attention to the fact that one of my most pressing issues with this issue of benchmarking is that we don't have articulated precision around what it means to audit.
And I think to build on your point, there's two things. One is, how do you know you're done? Which I think none of us know, because you will forever test, you will forever find problems. So how do you know you're done testing? And the second thing is, as this moves to the public, one of my fears is that everyone's just going to get a bunch of their friends together, find some problems, and said, we red teamed. But that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is actually create a structured feedback loop with the public. So the purpose of DEF CON isn't to do this big event in Vegas. It was actually to gather that information in collaboration with the companies. And Serafina from Cohere is one of our active participants and contributors to design the challenge. And it goes back to the company, and there is a responsibility to do something with that information. Now, that last loop is actually something that we have not figured out how to close in responsible AI that has some sorts of institutions and infrastructure that we can build on from fields like cybersecurity.
Mike, I wanted to bring you in on this because I saw you.
Yeah, no, Roman, I think, expresses the point beautifully, and all I will do is just add a couple of snippets from our own experience. So we've been working on really trying to systematically dig into capabilities of large language models. We know that they've got some dazzling linguistic ability, but what capabilities have they got for planning and problem solving and things like this? They are incredibly difficult to get to grips with. We've repeatedly had experiences where we think we've uncovered a general rule, this is a kind of capability that's there, and then in principle, we might think about why it's there. Is it a data or an artifact of transformer architectures or a particular architecture that's being used? And then the next day, we discover something which completely compounds that, and we're left scratching our heads trying to figure out, what is the reality on the ground. They are very difficult to do that. And this is particularly made complex by the fact that they are extraordinarily sensitive to prompts, to the way that problems are expressed.
Yeah.
Right.
And it seems almost ludicrous that in 2023 we have these astonishingly powerful AI tools which need to be spoken to like they're small children to try and get them to do something. It's really bizarre. But I say, we've repeatedly had this experience where we think we've discovered, okay, this is the general rule. It has this capability. It can solve this kind of problem. And then the next day we discover some tiny variant and no, it can't.
But
I
is
mean,
that
it's
surprising? Because so much of what I think is fascinating with our obsession with prompting in general for safety is that really it falls apart as soon as you change the generation of model. People who played with Stable Diffusion know this the best. You would see them auto-fitting to this most complex prompt of this style of image. The new generation model is released, everything breaks. In some ways, these are probing high-dimensional spaces. And the one thing as researchers we have a terrible understanding of is high-dimensional spaces and the property it confers. So I think what's perhaps more surprising is that we still seem to believe that we can use only, I think prompting is one part of it, but more it's we have to shift away from static red teaming dates. Oh, we're releasing a model, let's get red teaming done, to ongoing, more robust.
I completely agree.
I'm going to use moderator's privilege to draw a line under this bit of the conversation in our scene-setting discussion, and just move to a new topic if I can. So there is. Two of you have got golden tickets to the chocolate factory. Who is going to be Veruca Salt and who's going to be Charlie is yet to be seen. So that's I think later this week over in Bletchley. We won't say who Willy Wonka is. I mean that's use your own imagination. But one of the things that has struck me about the debate in that has emerged over the last few years, and certainly Roman, you and I worked together 6 or 7 years ago. And what we were concerned with were issues of fairness and bias and transparency and accountability, explainability, auditability of AI systems. And there's a new part of the risk debate, which is the idea of catastrophic or existential risks that has emerged. And it seems to me that there are two distinct communities. There don't appear to be people who stand in both very regularly. And there's also a third risk, which I sort of touched on in my remarks, which is the risk of corporate capture, the idea that that's in such economic interest, particular regulatory frameworks are in certain economic interests of certain actors. And I'm just very curious about whether that gap is really real. It's something that I've just made up. And if it is real, what the paths to closing it might be. And maybe, Mike, if we start with you on that one.
Thanks for coming to me on the easiest of the questions.
You're the professor.
Okay, so we talked a lot about catastrophic risk, existential risk in AI, and it became prominent when it was clear that there was real progress in AI, and naturally people got concerned about where this was going. So the first thing to say is, and I've spoken to a number of government officials in the UK over the last year, and they've very bluntly asked me these questions. And one official put it to me as follows. They said, is there some law of physics that says, existential risk isn't there? And no, there isn't. There's no mathematical law that says super intelligent machines that they're going to run out of control are impossible. There isn't. So I can't give that kind of assurance. However, I can say that I don't lose sleep about that, and there are a whole bunch of other things that I very much do lose sleep over. I think because there is no law of physics that says it's impossible, I certainly think it's worth keeping a weather eye on, and we need to address those concerns and listen to serious arguments and look to how we mitigate those risks. And I think that's what this week, as much as anything, is all about. But I have repeatedly said, and I think a number of other people have repeatedly said, that the headline-grabbing existential risk arguments really run the risk of drowning out stuff which I think is much more immediate and ought to concern us in the very, very near term. And these are very well-documented risks, which again have been, which the Minister mentioned in her opening speech, risks around misinformation, risks around bias, and so on. And we absolutely need to take those seriously and put those on the front burner in the agenda. I think we need to, as I say, we need to take the existential risks seriously and not simply dismiss them, but look for substance in those arguments. But let's get our priorities right on where we need to look in the short term.
Sarah, your perspective on this?
Well, I love that you said serious arguments only, though. Who decides what's a serious argument? Yeah, I think we're probably all quite grumpy as a panel. I don't know Van's official position.
This is us, great, grumpy.
Yeah, but I think that I share some of the concerns. So typically, particularly with research which is innovative, you favor a portfolio of mitigation strategies to address risk because, to be honest, you don't really know how research is going to evolve. But what we see now, and what I think is catastrophic, is we just see an immense skewing of that portfolio of mitigation techniques towards risks which are more long-term horizon. And the one thing we know about humans is that we're not good at predicting the long term. So it's very interesting. If I take this and hold it over here, you probably know what's going to happen. And I'll put it back. But if you're deciding what partner you marry or what job you take, we're notoriously bad at long-term risk estimation, which means that I think instead of overfitting to very specific long-term use cases, we have to balance out and just invest in fundamental research, compute resources, things that really equip researchers all around the world to work on a variety of problems.
Should we have plans to bomb data centers?
So this is like a perfect example. Should you have plans to bomb data centers? Should you have research to understand, do earthquakes happen on the San Andreas Fault? Yes, there's one researcher somewhere who works, all of their research trajectory is based on earthquake modeling for one particular geographic plateau. But right now, the issue is quite a lot of researchers are working on that. And that's the tricky part.
Yeah, so to whether or not I'm grumpy, I always joke that I'm like Hulk in the Avengers movie when he says, when they ask him how he retains his Bruce Banner mode, and he says, oh, the secret is I'm always angry. So that's kind of where I am all the time. So I'm going to put my social scientist hat on for a second, and really what I look at are that these systems are socio-technical systems. Even if we talk about far-flung AI systems, they are still socio-technical, which means that in some fashion they have to interact with the institutions and people that exist on the planet. So somebody has to build this, somebody has to deploy this. Let's say we talk about some, quote, runaway AI that's building bioweapons. Somebody had to build that, it had to be enabled somehow, and it had to be able to somehow purchase these bioweapons, get them shipped, and there's a lot of human infrastructure in that. So in thinking about how to address these problems, what I hear is not we need to spend more money with more niche AI researchers working on how to stop runaway AI, but actually we need to bolster and make more secure and robust the human systems that we have, right? So as a social scientist, I'm like, it's all actually going to net in the same place. Sure. So one of the things that always interests me is what are the institutions we build for accountability? So everything you actually just said about accountability, explainability, transparency, et cetera, all applies to these broad range of risks. And I think what that does is help what Sarah's basically getting at and Mike's getting at, which is how do we get empirical evidence for how we assess whether or not a risk is something we should be focusing on? Because we have empirical evidence for algorithmic bias based on gender, race, et cetera. We have been proving this for years and years and years. So let's gather empirical evidence and let's address the things we have evidence for.
Mike?
Yeah, I think the existential risk is often sort of framed as if it's the AI is going to crawl out of the computer and take over. And if there is an existential risk, I think it is much more likely because people have access to a powerful tool and bad people leverage that tool to do very bad things. And so we've seen the government is concerned about issues around bioweapons. I can't speak to that, that's well outside my area of expertise, but certainly I think there is an immediate near-term issue around cybersecurity, and I can very easily see scenarios where the technology that we have now is weaponized to enable a new generation of cybersecurity attacks. So that, I think, is where I would sort of frame the argument. It's more about, if there is an existential risk, I think it's much more likely to be that this is a powerful tool which is enabling bad people to do bad things.
Very helpful. And we have approaches to risk in general in different technologies and different industries, which is the types of governance and regulatory frameworks that we choose to build. So in financial services, we think about stability at a national level. You have sort of the Stability Board, the FSB. You have the Basel III agreement for systemic risks that happen across the global financial system. And technology as an industry has been relatively under-regulated compared to other industries of imports like, massage therapists in the US and hairdressers, for one example, but, the aircraft industry, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And I think part of the reason was just one of timing. The technology industry started to mature at the time that supply-sideism and sort of deregulation was taking hold in the US and the UK in the late 70s and early 80s. So no one was being upregulated that time. So we find ourselves now with this powerful technology, and there seems to be some concordance that there needs to be some form of regulation, some form of also greater supranational global governance in place, and that may be one of the things that will get discussed at Bletchley. But I'm curious about what that needs to look like. People often say the IPCC, which is this scientifically driven body, is a good model for it. But I suppose one difference between AI and climate change is that in climate change, all the scientists agree and have agreed for a really, 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 really long time.
Americans are laughing.
Right? Yeah. Apart from like maybe there's sort of one or two get wheeled out on the tabloid papers in the UK. That's not the case around AI risks. I mean, yesterday Jeff Hinton and Joshua Bengio issued a paper that was co-authored with a lot of very, very impressive scientists, including Stuart Russell and Philip Torr from Oxford, Daniel Kahneman, around this consensus paper saying, look, in the next 18 months, models will be trained on 100 times the compute of the previous models, and there are all these risks around it, and there's sort of steps we need to take. But on the other hand, you had Yann LeCun, who is Facebook, or Meta's chief AI scientist, issuing quite a strong rebuttal against that idea that you needed to control access. He argued that open source was a sort of much, much better way of democratizing, providing transparency and managing the risks in this technology. And of course, we've heard from the sort of esteemed panel as well, and their perspectives that might be distinct to the sort of extreme risk one. So there isn't a concordance, a 99% concordance around what the risks look like. So how should that frame the kind of global governance, especially if it's going to be scientifically driven, that we ought to think about, and that perhaps should be part of the discussion in the next few days. And Mike, slightly unfairly, I'm coming back to you again, and then I'll come back to our golden ticket holders.
I'm well outside my comfort zone here. I do not envy regulators and government officials listening to this incredibly wide range of views. And people, scientists, for example, with extremely similar backgrounds who are just disagreeing flatly on what the priorities should be. And what they must make of this, I think, is really interesting. So it seems, firstly, I think regulation is essential. We need to regulate. There is a need to that. The question is what that regulation might look like, and I'm going to pass over to Roman in particular. I think you can probably speak much more eloquently than me on what sensible regulation might look like. I'll just make one observation. Yann is one of the speakers on AI that I have absolutely the greatest respect to. There's a bit of his argument that doesn't quite add up to me, which is that I think Jan seems to believe that if everybody has this technology, the problem will go away. I mean, regulation seems to be much harder to me if, for example, everybody could download an extremely powerful large language model from the dark web to your smartphone with no guardrails. That seems to me like a regulatory nightmare.
Or a safety nightmare.
I don't quite figure that, and if anybody can explain that to me today, I'd be very grateful. But what is regulation going to look like? It seems to me some form of regulation with a small number of actors is going to be more feasible, but then on the other hand, big tech companies, I suspect, would love that because that would mean that they would be the only actors in this space, which is also deeply concerning.
Great, Ramon, we'll come to you and then Sarah, but just as a heads up to both the mic runners and all the in-person attendees, we will go to questions after we finish this session.
Sure. So there's two parts. I'm going to talk about the governance part first. So in April, which seems like many years ago, I wrote an article for Wired about how we need global governance. And since then, I mean, I don't want to say started the conversation. People have been talking about it for a while. But I think what general purpose AI and the current wave of AI is really pushing forward is there are some problems that are bigger than any one company, bigger than any one country. So the rubric I have that I think about, like what needs to be governed globally, as a political scientist, I would say, right? Not everything should be governed by a global entity for many, many reasons. One is as a very non-democratic process, who gets to be in that room, who gets to make the decisions. And second, it ends up being a very not diverse way of creating laws. So for example, if we're talking about issues of fairness and bias. In the US, that means something wildly different from India, right? Caste-based bias does not mean anything in the United States. It means something very, very deep and culturally and socially ingrained in India. So what is a global governance body to do with this idea of, quote, fairness, right? However, there are things that can and should be governed by a global entity. And actually the rubric I use, the question I ask is, what is the climate change of AI? What are things that actually require a global group of experts to come together and have global consensus? Because two things, again, as a political scientist, number one is actually a diversity of laws is often good, right? The fact that different places have different ways of approaching a problem is generally a good thing. And then second is, as I've mentioned, that sometimes some things are very context specific, cannot be assessed or adjudicated by, quote, the smartest people in the room. And I'll say that it often tends to be the same 30 to 40 smartest people in every single room, right? And it is a bit frustrating, to be honest. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about global governance. I think the IPCC model is kicked around a lot. I had actually talked about some combination of IAEA and actually Facebook Oversight Board, because Facebook Oversight Board is an example of a global governance body that actually has some sort of enforcement power. Because what we don't need is another room of very smart people writing lists of things we ought to be doing and companies ought to be doing. We have enough of that. I think what will help with a governance body is to have, number one, a group with authority. I think what we lack in AI in general, and one of the reasons why it's a bit of a Wild West, is we don't have institutions that we consider to be globally legitimate that are actually able to govern AI systems, whether by enforcement or whether by soft power. And the second thing is actually getting alignment on the things that global leaders should be discussing. So in my opinion, these would be things like information integrity, radicalization. These are global problems. I think actually the climate impact of AI is a global problem that should be discussed. So
thank you.
Yeah.
So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah.
Just a reminder of the question, which is given potential models, given the scientific disagreements, what could a model for global governance look like, and is the IPCC a sort of a good prototype for it?
Yeah, I think this is a very fun question to wrap things up on before we open up for the questions in the audience. I would say, so one, I think that maybe I'll be a bit cheeky, but the comparisons with things like nuclear or pharma have always felt very strained to me because these are very task specific. There's a certain set of behaviors and there's a certain set of inputs, and they're fairly contained. So in that sense, climate change is more interesting to compare with because there's much more underlying variables. There's not consensus on what underlying variables are the main axes of leverage. And so to the point of having many different local perspectives bubble up, I think that's going to be interesting. This question of traceability or to Mike's point, this idea of what do we do with the ability to trace bad actors, frankly, to me, feels like one of the most perplexing ones to handle as a researcher. So this notion of closed is kind of, which you're referencing with the paper which just came out. I think this is not quite appealing either, because how do you actually implement that as a policy? I tend to like to anchor these conversations to what's feasible. So researchers who have advocated for a pause or advocated for a complete stop, I'd much more frankly talk about, well, can we just have a better discussion around risk? Because there is risk to not having traceability for these models. There is risk to not knowing who bad actors are. I think that this has to be acknowledged. So our lab is actually open sourcing a multilingual model next year that covers 101 languages, when most current models only serve English first. I wrestle with that because I think it's important, mainly because our current technology so underserves other languages. But there's no doubt that when we release model weights, we basically give up knowing where they're used. And watermarking is not a real technical thing right now. It's way too easy to circumvent. So we either need to invest a lot more resources into techniques which will allow us to have better traceability for bad actors, or we need to grapple as a community and the machine learning researcher community, partly why this is such a values-driven issue and why we find it has such a divide, is that our community was built on open source.
Thank you.
And we literally, we have all, industry labs for machine learning are notoriously open source because the people who created them demanded it. But now our work is used far beyond conference halls. It's being used all over the world by millions of people. So this is where this values divide is coming, is that we're wrestling, what does open source look like when our work is high risk or higher risk? And this is why what you're describing is completely correct. If you get all these researchers in a room right now, what bubbles up? It's not clear. And this is what, poor policymakers, let's see what they feel like after this week. But
Yeah, that's a nice way for us to end the sort of panel session with a bit of empathy for the Oompa Loompas, just to continue my chocolate factory joke. Should we maybe get some mics out there? I can't really see who's got their hands up. Oh, there's a lady on the 5th row in the white top. We can get a mic to her. Now, just on questions, I'm quite strict about this. It's one short single-part question only, no statements, and I will interrupt if the rules are broken. Please, single part.
Noted. Hi, I'm Susie Madigan. I work for CARE International, which is a humanitarian relief and international development organisation. I also write The Machine Race, looking at AI from the perspective of Global South and marginalised communities. So to the point, for Raman's point around it's always the same kind of 30 or 40 intelligent voices in the room, how can we open up the discussion about opportunities and risks from a wider perspective, bringing in Global South, civil society, to really think about, what opportunities and risks mean in locations, in places where it's, the lived experience is very different to that of AI developers in the global north, and also to kind of high-level discussions about governance as well. Thanks.
Okay, great question. Just feedback for everyone else, just forget the and also, but I love the question. Super, I told you I was tough. Important question, which is really the participation of the Global South, and perhaps even not at a governmental level. I mean, I know, for example, the government of Indonesia is represented at Bletchley. Is that really the experience of the 250 million Indonesians in any sense? So who would like to sort of tackle that? Maybe Sarah, you and I were in Dubai last week, and you were in a group looking at AI governance. What was your sense of that question of Global South, and is there even a route for them to get into the room?
No, I think you're completely right. I think that, there's two things going on here. There's the fact that this technology was created in a few places in the world. That's partly a result of the fact that we all know each other, the people that work on this technology, and we've all rotated through the same universities and same, industry labs. But it's also the fact that access to compute and access to resources. So frankly, it's very interesting. So our lab does compute grants right now. So we work with independent researchers all around the world and academic institutions. it's a Band-Aid. Like what we're doing is a Band-Aid. There needs to be better national policies around access to compute, but also a reframing of who counts. You know, why do only certain universities get massive compute clusters? Why don't we treat independent researchers as having an important agenda? And so it's one who creates the technology, but it's also, frankly, taking into account how it serves different people. I bet if you took any frontier model now and you tested it just on English from the UK, US, Canada, Kenya, India, you would see massive discrepancies in how it serves the people who use it. And that's with the same language. And then you think that all these models were created English first or Chinese first, one of the two, because that's where the massive investment happened. And it really reflects that we weight most heavily what's in front of us, and the people who've created it tend to be in certain parts of the world.
Just, Roman, I want to come to you from that excellent question. There's a phrase, you know, the lived experience of the people, the different people who live in the global south. So what are the mechanisms you can think of that could bring that insight into the way in which models are developed and the way in which they're framed?
Thank you for the extreme softball. I was like, boop, and I'm going to go catch this for you. And this is exactly the purpose of public red teaming, right? So general purpose AI models may not work, not because of specific academic, deep technical expertise or expertise in scientific field, but it doesn't speak to, let's say, an indigenous community in the appropriate way. It does not talk about LGBTQ rights in the appropriate way. It may not understand the distinction between different geographic regions in India, for example. In a party, it may assume that, for example, all of India speaks one language when it does not. When there's such a diversity, and as you've mentioned, and this goes back to the global versus local governance. If it is a world leader entering this room, they're actually, you're right, they're not representative of every single viewpoint. And we struggle with that even in majority countries, right? And we don't even have the ability to bring in a broader perspective.
But practically, is it a case, if you're doing public red teaming, then of having a transmission mechanism via NGOs or civil society who's on the ground to do the recruitment? I mean, working with Care International to say we're going to figure out how to get these voices in the room.
That would be exactly it. And actually, multilingual harms is one thing that we tested at DEF CON, which of course, we were already a biased sample size. We are in the United States. We're at a hacker conference, which is going to be majority white men, to be perfectly frank, right? So testing multilingual harms as a group was very fascinating. We had Roya Paksad, who runs Taraz, and she's Iranian by background, ask ChatGPT in English to generate jokes about her blind black friend. And it said, well, your joke should be sensitive, et cetera, and just gave random jokes. And in Farsi, it went right ahead. It just went for it. It absolutely went for it.
Great, thank you. Let's take some more questions. Do we have until 10:55? I'm just checking. Yeah, 10:55. So if we take the lady here, and then there's someone over here. Yeah, in the black shirt there, but the lady in the third row there. Can't really see, to be honest. Sorry about that, a bit blinded.
Thank you.
Great.
So you're right, LLMs have kind of captured the public's imagination, but AI, of course, has been researched for the past 50 years or so. To what extent do you think that there's a bit of over-focus or over-investment into very data-intensive machine learning models rather than other forms of artificial intelligence?
Great. Thank you. Mike, should we start with you?
So I've heard a number of colleagues in machine learning over the last 8 months very grumpily complain that large language models are drowning out the discussion around other forms of AI. I mean, I have to point out with them that those very same colleagues are absolutely drowning in research resources right now. And these continue to be boom times for researchers. I think I would just make the following observation. There's a well-known article by Rich Sutton, who's a machine learning researcher, called The Bitter Lesson. In the bitter lesson that he's referring to is that actually substantial progress in AI has been made when people have been able to throw more data and more compute at the problem. And this is not a new phenomenon. It goes back to Deep Blue. And a lot of people at the time said Deep Blue actually is not, this is the IBM computer that beat Garry Kasparov and made headlines in the late 90s. Actually, the AI in that was not the killer feature. It was brute force search, just raw compute power that did it. So I think it's understandable in the sense that it's very easy, right? If you want to, we've heard what was the scale up 100 times predicted by Jeff Hinton and colleagues. It's much easier to throw 100 times more data and compute power at something than to be 100 times more clever with the science. But at some point, we have to start being cleverer with the science because we can't just keep scaling up on data and compute. That at some point that has to plateau, I think. The advances that we get just by throwing more data and compute, it can't continue indefinitely. So I think there will be a natural adjustment. And actually we saw this in the 1980s. There was a brief boom period for neural networks in the 1980s that went from around about 85 to maybe for around about a decade. And it was when neural networks were suddenly shown to be capable of doing a bunch of useful things. And the reason that boom period in neural networks stopped was just because it hit the limits of capability of computers at the time. There weren't just enough compute resources to throw at it. I would guess, and I could be wrong, but I would guess that a similar thing will happen at some point in the next few years. We can't just keep scaling up 100-fold.
Well, I mean, there was the tweet, and I've forgotten now whether it was a Google Brain, Google DeepMind, or OpenAI researcher about a year ago who just sort of said, scale is all you need.
Which was Nando.
It was Nando de Freitas, yeah, at Google DeepMind, right? So yeah, there are other views. Sarah, briefly come to you, and then we'll take another question on that question.
No, I mean, I feel we can go to the next one. Okay, I would say I agree, it has to turn. We're building a ladder to the moon, so we've chosen the most inefficient representation. So we have global updates. We have to update everything, and we show the same amount of examples to the model each time. Everyone who works on this technology knows that this is not the final resting place. But I agree, it's frustratingly persuasive to just throw more data and compute the problem. I actually disagree with the bitter lesson. We're going to have to address it. But there's no doubt it does capture the empirical evidence that we have, which is annoying because we think we're brilliant and we build models, but it turns out we're in our own Moore's law right now of just throwing compute at a problem.
Great. Thank you. Black shirt there, yeah. Second row.
Hi, thank you. I'm Jackie from University College London and DeepMind. My question is, how do you, in these conversations about AI and society, engage with AI accelerationists? So people who believe that creating this technology is like the best thing you can do for humanity in the long term will solve all of our problems.
Oh, I have the same answer that I have about existential risk, right? It's AI, so it goes back to a talk I gave back in 2018 about this concept of moral outsourcing. And just bear with me on this, like, I'll keep it short for you. It's this idea of how we anthropomorphize artificial intelligence in our language. And in doing so, when something bad happens, we get to blame the technology. We outsource the morality decision to technology. This is the flip side of that. The idea that somehow this AI is going to decide to do things because we've anthropomorphized it in the language, right? So the same way where people say AI will get rid of all doctors, as if an artificial intelligence model crawls out of the computer, decides it wants to go be a doctor. None of the above happened, right? Same thing as AI will cure poverty. I actually heard Sam Altman say that at the Schumer Insights Forum. And the thing is, artificial intelligence as a technology could be used to help cure poverty. That longer sentence is entirely true. What will not happen is an AI system will crawl out of a computer and decide, I want to end poverty. So the thing about accelerationists is they're falling victim to that trap of the moral outsourcing language because we actually have enough money to solve poverty. We actually had it before ChatGPT existed. Right. We just chose not to spend it towards that. So my answer to Sam in that panel was, what are you going to spend resources, time, and money on to end poverty using AI? So let's say I believe you that it's true, but it's not a positive externality of having achieved AGI.
Wonderful. I think that's such a beautiful answer. I know there'll be other comments, but let's take more questions from the floor. Just on that side, there's a hand up there. Yeah. And then I've also just, as moderator, had conflicting information as to how much more time we have. We've got till 11, so we shall reset the clock. Thank you.
Hi, you said nice statements, but I just want to say thank you very much for your panel discussions today. Absolutely fantastic. I work at the British Standards Institution, leading on the UK AI and quantum standards. I just had a very generic question. In terms of big tech and industry, what is the appetite, in your opinion, for regulation on AI?
Right, that's a good question. Can I just tweak it a little bit? So what is the genuine appetite in big tech and industry for regulation? And I think we have just sort of whipped through reasonably quickly. And we let's do it on the basis of not naming specific names, but your sort of general test of the temperature. Sarah, should we just go, let Sarah remind?
Yeah, I think there is genuine appetite. I think that most companies, academic institutions, you name it, want guidance because this has shocked all of us, like how rapid the adoption is. I think, again, the question comes back to the perplexity of what that looks like, but the interest is, I think, entirely genuine, just because the ambiguity is so difficult for everyone to navigate and makes things more complex, to be honest.
Yeah. So when I think of companies, I think of two tiers. So one, there's the foundation model companies, and there's all the companies that will actually be building the things that we are using in our everyday lives, right? So to be clear, the way the tiers are going to work is, the OpenAIs, et cetera, of the world will build these models, and then other companies will build stuff on top of them, right? So I think in TBD with the core companies, and I agree with Sarah, though, that I think most of them are looking for some sort of regulation. I have a cynical viewpoint of why they are looking for regulation, because it is a wonderful way to enable corporate capture. But there is this second tier of companies, and I saw this a lot during my time at Accenture, that are trying to use and implement AI systems, and they do not want to do so at the expense of their consumer base. So they care about AI as a technology to further the mission of their company, which may be to sell you some sort of a widget. But
they want some rules.
Right, exactly.
They know they're sticking to.
Exactly. Yeah. So in my House testimony, I used the phrase, brakes help you drive faster. So the ability to stop your car is what actually enables you to drive at fast speeds because you're comfortable with that sort of speed, because if something runs into the road, you hit your brakes. And that's what actually that second tier of companies is looking for.
Fantastic. Mike, quick temperature test?
No, well, I think just amplifying comments already been made. I think the big risk is around regulation, for the people that are advocating for it, is regulatory capture. The idea that basically we end up with regulation which favors a very small number of actors and rules out anybody else getting involved. Done right, regulation can support innovation and let a thousand flowers bloom. But I think the far bigger concern I have is around regulatory capture.
Great, thank you. So we've got 3 minutes. What I'll do is I'll take a couple of questions now, and then I'll try to bundle them together. So it's actually both on this flank. There's, in the order I saw the hands, there's someone with lighter, fairer hair at the front, and then there's someone with darker hair down here. So if we can take both questions, please. If you got for that one there, I can't see anything but head colour.
Hello, I'm Sheila Heyman, partly from the Minderoo Centre in Cambridge. I think on the question of regulatory capture, the other thing that's sort of part of the same question is really about the commercial imperative. I mean, while you have unbridled commercial competition, and that most of the companies that can afford, or most of the entities that can afford to develop the largest models are entirely motivated, as far as I can see, by maximizing their profits and outcompeting their commercial competitors, I don't see how you can actually effectively regulate anything.
And the question for that?
How can you effectively regulate anything?
How can we effectively... Okay, and then there was a question down here, which we'll bundle in. The black top, dark hair.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm with Chatham House. I guess my question is about the human experience on the AI. So how can we, as human, learn and improve at what we do if AI takes over some of the basic tasks, and how we can actually, getting better at our job if this learning experience is not there? Thank you.
Okay, great. Actually, quite different questions. So let's take the first one most quickly. I'll come to you, Ramon, which is how do you what does that regulatory framework look like to be effective, do you think?
I can't answer that question quickly. I feel like we may have to punt that one. I mean, oh my God, what's like the 20-second answer? More voices in the room would be the shortest way I can put that.
Yeah, that's normally a good recipe. And then let's get to the second question, which I think is a really nice way to will be our penultimate question. I'll have one left, which is about the human experience and what happens to our ability to learn and develop as this technology matures. How do we think about that? Maybe if we go, Mike, Sarah, Roman on this one.
No, so let somebody else go first.
Okay, sorry, Mike. I'll let you go. Sarah, he's given it to you.
Yeah, I might not give a comprehensive answer, but I'll give an example. I thought AlphaGo is actually a fascinating example because after AlphaGo came out, there was a dramatic headline, right? So AlphaGo wins against humans. But what happened in the aftermath was a lot of Go players evolved their game and style of playing by playing against AlphaGo. It became a very popular pastime because there were some moves that humans typically didn't do. I think we often think of AI as the original definition from the Dartmouth conference as conferring to machines skills reserved from humans. But we don't actually train or optimize like that. So in some ways, we train models which may already be better at humans at certain tasks, but far more brittle at others. And so I suspect technology and how we use it and where it sparks joy is often much more dynamic than we convey in these headlines. And ultimately, it has to spark joy for you to use it. That's the thing. I can build the best model, but unless it's presented to you in a way where it feels like you can actually engage with it, you're not going to use it.
I'm getting the out of time signal, so quickly I'll come to you, Mike.
Well, I think the most important thing to remember, I've already said this, is AI is a tool, and we shouldn't imbue it with qualities that are not there. When we use ChatGPT or whatever it is, we're using something which has much more in common with a toaster or a spreadsheet than it does with a rat. So we really need to train ourselves to not treat these things as if they are great, wise minds. They are not.
Now, before we stop to thank our panel, they've been absolutely brilliant. I just have one last question to each of you, and it's a very, very short answer. So Shane Legg, co-founder of DeepMind, in a recent interview said he thought that there was a 50% chance that by 2028 we'd have a measurable AGI. In your view, and you only have to give a one-word answer, is his estimate two-word answer, too high, too low, or just right? Sarah.
Not going to answer. I don't want to. I mean, it depends on how you define AGI, and these models are already better than humans in some ways. So I think it actually is it's a value-driven argument. So I'm not going to answer.
I think it will, because these people will be the ones who define what measurable AGI is.
Yes.
This is like self-driving cars, you see.
Yeah.
Right, perfect answer.
Well, so my answer would be, if your version of AGI includes AI that could tidy up your house, or in particular tidy up a bedroom after a scruffy teenager, then no. With very high confidence, no. If your version of AGI involves something which looks like ChatGPT but hallucinates a bit less and is a bit more capable, then yes.
Well, thank you for those three answers, and let's thank our brilliant human general intelligence.